The evening sky turned a soft orange as the sun began to set over Oakwood Gardens. Marissa Johnson walked around the community pool, clipboard in hand, checking off the last items on her daily list. The water was still, reflecting the clouds above like a perfect mirror. 3 years of doing this routine had made it second nature to her. Test the chlorine levels, make sure no toys were left behind, and lock the gate securely. Almost done, she mumbled to herself, jotting down the chemical readings. The neighborhood kids had left hours ago, their laughter still echoing in her memory. Being the pool manager wasn't glamorous, but Marissa took pride in keeping this space safe for everyone. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and closed the equipment shed. The metal key ring jingled as she pulled out the main gate key. That's when she felt it, that uncomfortable feeling of being watched. Marissa glanced up and noticed a woman standing on the sidewalk across the street, arms crossed, staring at her with narrowed eyes. The woman's posture was stiff, her gaze unwavering. Marissa offered a friendly wave, thinking she might be a new neighbor. The community had grown lately, with several new families moving in over the summer. Instead of waving back, the woman marched toward the pool gate with purpose in her steps. Her sundress fluttered in the evening breeze as she approached, her face set in a tight expression. "Excuse me," the woman called out before Marissa could even get the key in the lock. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Marissa turned, surprised by the confrontational tone. "Just closing up the pool for the night. I'm the pool manager." She smiled, extending her hand. "I'm Marissa. Are you new to Oakwood?" The woman ignored Marissa's outstretched hand. "I'm Lisa Winters. I moved in 2 months ago, and I've never seen you here before." Her eyes darted from Marissa to the pool equipment and back again. "Well, I usually close up around this time. I live over on Maple Street, been here about 3 years now." Marissa pointed vaguely in the direction of her home, just 3 blocks away where her husband was probably starting dinner. Lisa's eyebrow raised skeptically. "Right, and you have permission to be locking our facilities." The emphasis on "our" wasn't lost on Marissa. She'd been down this road before, the assumption that she didn't belong, even in her own neighborhood, even after 3 years of serving on the community board. Keeping her voice steady, Marissa reached into her pocket and pulled out her community ID badge with pool committee chair printed beneath her photo. "Yes, I do. The HOA appointed me to the position last year, and I was re-elected in April." Lisa barely glanced at the badge. "That could be fake. I attend all the meetings, and I don't remember voting for you." Marissa took a deep breath, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest. The evening had been peaceful until now. All she wanted was to finish up and get home to her family, not deal with yet another person questioning her presence. "Look, if you're concerned, we can walk over to the community office together. Tom should still be there. He can confirm who I am." Marissa suggested this as a peace offering, hoping to diffuse the situation. But Lisa had already pulled out her phone. "I don't think that will be necessary," she said, stepping back and keeping her eyes fixed on Marissa. "I'm calling the proper authorities. Don't move." Marissa stood still, keys dangling from her fingers, as Lisa dialed 911. The sunset colors had deepened now, casting long shadows across the pool deck. "Yes, hello." Lisa spoke into the phone, her voice suddenly louder. "I need to report suspicious activity at the Oakwood Gardens community pool. There's someone here, a black woman I've never seen before, and she's trying to lock up our facilities. I think she might be breaking in or vandalizing property." Marissa closed her eyes for a moment, letting the absurdity of the situation wash over her. From pool manager to suspected criminal in the span of 5 minutes. Another evening, another reminder that to some people, her face would always look out of place, no matter how much she belonged. As Lisa continued describing her to the dispatcher, emphasizing her race and suspicious behavior, Marissa sent a quick text of her husband. "Might be late. Someone called the cops on me at the pool." Again, Lisa kept her phone pressed tightly against her ear, stepping farther away from Marissa as though distance would somehow protect her. "Yes, I'm still here," she told the dispatcher, her eyes never leaving Marissa. "She claims she's the pool manager, but I've lived here for 2 months and never seen her before." Marissa's shoulders dropped as she heard this. 2 months versus her 3 years in the community. The absurdity would have been funny if it weren't so frustrating. She slipped her phone back into her pocket after texting her husband and placed her clipboard down on a nearby table. "Ma'am, I'm going to sit right here while we wait," Marissa said calmly, pointing to one of the pool chairs. "Is that okay with you? My feet are tired after standing all day at the hospital." Lisa covered the mouthpiece of her phone. "Hospital? What hospital?" "I'm a pediatric nurse at Mercy Children's. Been there 8 years now." Marissa sat down slowly, making sure her movements didn't appear threatening. Years of similar experiences had taught her the unwritten rules of these encounters. Liz's expression flickered with something, doubt perhaps, but she quickly recovered. "The dispatcher wants to know if you're trying to leave," she said, ignoring Marissa's mention of her profession. "No," Marissa replied, folding her hands in her lap. "I'm waiting right here. I want the officers to see that I have the pool keys and my ID badge. Running would only make me look guilty of something I didn't do." The evening was growing cooler now. Other residents walked their dogs along the sidewalks surrounding the pool area, a few glancing curiously at the two women, but continuing on their way. Marissa recognized Mr. Patterson with his golden retriever and waved. He hesitated, waved back, then hurried along. "They'll be here in 10 minutes, Lisa announced after hanging up. She remained standing, positioned between Marissa and the gate, as though guarding against an escape. "You know," Marissa said, trying once more to diffuse the tension, "there's a community directory with photos of all the committee members. If you'd like, I can show you where to find it online." "I don't need to see any directory," Lisa replied, thumbs flying across her phone screen as she typed something. "The police can sort this out." Marissa leaned back in the chair and looked up at the darkening sky. Stars were beginning to appear, tiny pinpricks of light breaking through the twilight. She planned to be home by now, helping her son with his science project. They were building a model of the solar system, and tonight it was supposed to paint Jupiter. "I just took over this position last year," Marissa offered, still trying to build some connection. "Before that, Mrs. Chen was the pool manager. Maybe you've met her. She runs the Saturday morning yoga class by the tennis courts." Lisa glanced up briefly. "I don't do yoga." The conversation died again. Lisa's phone pinged repeatedly, messages coming in. Marissa wondered if Lisa was texting other neighbors, spreading word of the suspicious person at their pool. A car drove slowly past the pool, and Lisa perked up, but it continued down the street. Not the police, not yet. "My son will be disappointed," Marissa said, more to herself than to Lisa. "We were supposed to work on his science project tonight." "You have children?" Lisa asked, seemingly surprised. "Yes, a 10-year-old boy. He's quite the artist." A hint of pride crept into Marissa's voice despite the situation. "He wants to design video games when he grows up." For a moment, Lisa's stern expression softened. "My nephew is into gaming too. He's always talking about becoming a developer." This tiny shared connection hung in the air between them, a fragile thread of common ground. But before Marissa could build on it, headlights swept across the pool area as a car turned into the parking lot. "They're here," Lisa said, straightening her posture and smoothing her dress. Marissa remained seated, hands visible on the armrests of the chair. The patrol car's red and blue lights weren't flashing, which she took as a good sign. The car doors opened, and 2 officers stepped out. Finally, Lisa said under her breath, already moving toward them, "Officers, thank you for coming so quickly. She's right over there." Marissa stood up slowly, gathering her clipboard and keys. She took a deep breath and prepared to explain herself yet again. As the officers approached, she recognized a familiar face and felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Officer Wilson?" she called out, her voice steadier than she felt inside. The taller officer looked up from his notepad, his expression changing from professional neutrality to recognition. "Mrs. Johnson, is that you?" The 20 minutes that Marissa waited for the police stretched like taffy, slow and painfully drawn out. The sky had fully darkened now, and the pool lights had automatically clicked on, casting an eerie blue glow across the water's surface. Crickets chirped in the bushes surrounding the pool area, that evening song a stark contrast to the tense silence between the two women. Marissa's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out carefully, aware of Lisa watching her every move. "My husband," Marissa explained, holding up the phone. He's wondering where I am. Lisa gave a stiff nod. You can answer it. Hey, David, Marissa said, keeping her voice steady. Yeah, still at the pool. No, don't come down here. I'm fine, really. The officers are on their way. She paused, listening. I know, honey. Tell Tommy I'll help with Jupiter tomorrow night. Promise. After hanging up, Marissa noticed Lisa studying her with a curious expression. Your husband's name is David? Lisa asked. Yes, going on 12 years now, Marissa replied, showing her wedding ring out of habit. We met in college. Lisa seemed to be processing this information, perhaps fitting it into her mental image of who Marissa might be. And your son is Tommy? Thomas, but yes, we call him Tommy. A small smile crossed Marissa's face. He's obsessed with space right now. Knows all the planets and their moons. For a brief moment, the tension between them eased slightly. But then Lisa's phone chimed with a message, pulling her attention away. She read something on her screen and frowned. The community Facebook group is very active, Lisa said, almost defensively. I posted about suspicious activity at the pool, and people are concerned. Marissa felt her heart sink. By morning, her name wouldn't be mentioned, but her description would be passed around like a warning. She'd been through this before at her previous apartment complex. The suspicious woman. The outsider, despite living there for years. Did you post my photo? Marissa asked quietly. Lisa hesitated. No, just a description. Small mercies, Marissa thought. At least the neighborhood kids wouldn't see their nurse's picture labeled as a trespasser. A couple walking a small white dog passed by the pool fence. The woman waved at Marissa, calling out, Evening, Mrs. Johnson. Pool all set for the weekend. All good, Mrs. Taylor. Marissa called back, forcing cheerfulness into her voice. Water's perfect for Saturday's swim meet. Lisa watched this exchange with visible confusion. Her grip on her phone tightened. You know her? She asked after the couple had moved on. The Taylors have lived here even longer than me, Marissa explained. Their grandson is one of my patients at the hospital. Before Lisa could respond, headlights swept across the pool deck as another car drove past, slowing down. This time, it was the patrol car they'd been waiting for. It pulled into the small parking lot, and two officers stepped out, adjusting their gear as they approached the gate. Marissa remained seated, her hands visible on the armrests. She'd learned long ago how to make officers feel comfortable during unexpected encounters. No sudden movements, clear visibility of the hands, calm, measured responses. Lisa, on the other hand, rushed forward to meet them. Officers, thank you for coming. I'm the one who called. The taller officer nodded professionally. Ma'am, I understand you reported someone suspicious at the community pool. Yes, this woman here claims she's the pool manager, but I've never seen her before, and she was locking up our facilities, Lisa explained, pointing toward Marissa. The second officer, a woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, looked over at Marissa with a puzzled expression. Then recognition dawned on her face. Mrs. Johnson, she called out. Marissa stood up slowly, relief washing over her. Officer Martinez, I didn't know you were on patrol in this area now. Officer Martinez smiled. Just started last month. Weren't you organizing the health fair at Pine Elementary last spring? The taller officer looked up from his notepad where he'd been taking Lisa's statement. Marissa Johnson, Coach Tommy's mom? Marissa nodded, feeling the tension in her shoulders finally begin to release. That's right, Officer Wilson. How's the team doing this season? Lisa stood frozen between them, her mouth slightly open as she watched the friendly exchange unfold. Her gaze darted from Marissa to the officers and back again, confusion evident in every feature of her face. Wait, she finally said, her voice smaller than before. You know her? Officer Wilson took off his cap and ran a hand through his short hair. Know her? Mrs. Johnson here has been helping me coach Little League for the past 2 summers. My boy wouldn't have figured out how to pitch without her help. He looked at Marissa with a friendly smile. Tommy's got quite an arm now, doesn't he? He's been practicing every day, Marissa replied, her voice steadier now. Wants to make the school team next year. Lisa stood between them, her mouth opening and closing without words coming out. The certainty that had fueled her actions for the past half hour seemed to be draining away, replaced by visible confusion. Officer Martinez stepped forward, clipboard in hand. Mrs. Johnson is the pool committee chair for Oakwood Gardens. Has been for what? A year and a half now. Just about, Marissa nodded, reaching for her community ID badge that still hung around her neck. The board appointed me last February, and I was re-elected this spring. Lisa's face flushed red, visible even under the blue-tinged pool lights. But I've never seen her here before. I thought. I'm usually here in the mornings before work, or evenings like today, Marissa explained gently, not wanting to embarrass Lisa despite everything. Our schedules probably just haven't overlapped. Officer Wilson turned to Lisa with a professional but cooler tone. Ma'am, could I see your ID, please? Just to confirm you're a resident here as well. Lisa fumbled in her purse, pulling out her driver's license. I moved in 2 months ago, on Sycamore Drive. As Officer Wilson examined her license, Officer Martinez walked around the pool area, surveying the equipment Marissa had been putting away. Just doing the regular evening closing? Officer Martinez asked, picking up Marissa's clipboard with the chemical readings. Yes, checking chemical levels, making sure no toys were left behind, locking up. Same routine as always, Marissa replied. The normalcy of their conversation seemed to unsettle Lisa even more. She shifted her weight from one foot to another, clutching her phone tightly. I didn't. Lisa began, then stopped. The neighborhood watch group said we should report suspicious activity. I was just trying to be careful. Officer Wilson handed Lisa back her license. Being vigilant is one thing, ma'am. Making assumptions is another. His tone wasn't harsh, but it carried a clear message. Mrs. Johnson here is not only a resident but a community leader and a pediatric nurse who's helped half the kids in this neighborhood at some point. Lisa looked down at her sandals. I didn't know. That's the point, Officer Martinez said, rejoining the group. You didn't know, but you assumed. More residents had noticed the police car by now. A small crowd was gathering outside the pool fence, neighbors walking over from nearby homes to see what was happening. Marissa recognized most of them. The Pattles from the corner house, Mr. Gonzalez who walked his dog every evening, the elderly Mrs. Washington who always brought cookies to community meetings. Everything okay, Marissa? Mr. Gonzalez called through the fence. We saw the police car and got worried. Before Marissa could answer, a breathless voice called out as someone pushed through the small crowd. Marissa, are you all right? It was David, her husband, who had clearly ignored her request to stay home. Officer Wilson unlocked the gate to let him in. David rushed to Marissa's side, placing a protective arm around her shoulders. I'm fine, really, Marissa assured him, though she leaned into his embrace, finally letting some of the tension leave her body. What happened? David asked, looking from the officers to Lisa. Just a misunderstanding, Officer Martinez said diplomatically. Lisa watched this new development with an increasingly distressed expression. The reality of what she had done was clearly sinking in. She wasn't confronting some anonymous trespasser, but a beloved community member surrounded by people who knew and respected her. I think, Lisa said quietly, I think I made a terrible mistake. The small crowd of neighbors had grown to almost a dozen people now, their curious faces pressed against the pool fence. Some were taking photos with their phones. One was live streaming to the neighborhood Facebook group, the same group where Lisa had posted her warning about a suspicious person. Officer Wilson turned to address them. Folks, there's no emergency here. Just a misunderstanding that's been cleared up. Everyone can head on home now. But Marissa knew that by tomorrow morning, everyone in Oakwood Gardens would have heard about what happened at the pool tonight. The story was already spreading through the crowd in whispers and text messages. Officer Martinez gently led Lisa away from the growing crowd, walking her toward the pool house where they could speak privately. Marissa watched them go, still leaning against her husband's side, his arms solid and reassuring around her shoulders. You okay? David whispered, giving her a gentle squeeze. I'm fine, Marissa said automatically, then caught herself. Actually, no. I'm tired, David. Tired of having to prove I belong in my own neighborhood. Officer Wilson overheard her and shook his head sympathetically. This shouldn't have happened to you, Mrs. Johnson. Not here, not anywhere. More neighbors had gathered outside the fence now, their confused chatter creating a background hum. Marissa spotted Mrs. Washington pushing through the crowd with her signature floral cane, her gray hair bobbing as she made her way to the front. Let me through, the elderly woman insisted. That's our pool manager you're all gawking at. Show some respect and go home. Several people stepped back at her sharp tone. Mrs. Washington had lived in Oakwood Gardens for nearly 30 years and commanded a certain respect. She pointed her cane at a teenager who was still filming with his phone. You, Bobby Henderson, put that phone away before I call your mother. The boy quickly lowered his phone, looking sheepish. Officer Wilson walked over to the gate and addressed the crowd more firmly. Folks, please disperse. This is a private matter, and everyone standing around is only making things more uncomfortable. Reluctantly, people began to drift away, though a few lingered, still curious about the drama unfolding in their usually quiet community. Meanwhile, by the pool house, Lisa's face was crumpled in distress as Officer Martinez spoke to her. Though Marissa couldn't hear what was being said, she could see Lisa nodding repeatedly, wiping at her eyes. Should we just go home? Marissa asked David. I still need to lock up, but honestly, I just want this day to be over. Before David could answer, Joe Rivera, the HOA president, came hurrying through the gate that Officer Wilson had left unlocked. His normally neat shirt was untucked, as if he'd rushed over without taking time to present his usual polished appearance. Marissa, I just got 3 different calls about police at the pool, he said breathlessly. What on earth happened? David's arm tightened protectively around Marissa. Someone decided my wife looked suspicious while doing her job. Joe's face fell as understanding dawned. Oh no, not this, not in our community. Especially in your community, Marissa said quietly. This isn't the first time, Joe, just the first time the police were called. Joe looked genuinely shocked. What? Why didn't you say something before? Because I handle it. I always handle it, Marissa replied, suddenly feeling the weight of years of handling it pressing down on her shoulders. The questions about whether I live here. The surprised looks when I mention I'm on the board. The way some people double-check their car locks when I walk by. Joe ran a hand through his thinning hair, visibly distressed. I had no idea. Most people don't, David said, his voice gentle but firm. That's the problem. Officer Martinez was walking back now, Lisa trailing behind her. Lisa's confident posture from earlier had completely vanished. She looked smaller somehow, her eyes red-rimmed and focused on the ground. Mrs. Winters has something she'd like to say, Officer Martinez announced, using a tone that suggested this wasn't optional. Lisa stepped forward, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. She took a deep breath before looking up to meet Marissa's eyes. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I made assumptions that were wrong and hurtful. There's no excuse for what I did. The apology hung in the air between them. Marissa had heard apologies before, some sincere, others merely performative. She studied Lisa's face, trying to gauge which kind this was. I was new and nervous about neighborhood security, Lisa continued when Marissa didn't immediately respond. But that's not an excuse for what I did. I didn't see you as a person, as a neighbor, and that was wrong. Joe cleared his throat. As HOA president, I want to make it clear that this type of behavior isn't acceptable in Oakwood Gardens. We're a community that values all our residents. Fine words, David muttered under his breath. Marissa squeezed his hand, silently asking him to let her handle this. She stepped forward, creating some space between herself and a protective circle of her husband and friends. Thank you for apologizing, she said to Lisa, her voice calm and measured. I accept your apology, but I hope you understand that words need to be followed by actions. The next morning, Marissa's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Text messages, voicemails, and notifications from the community Facebook group poured in faster than she could read them. She sat at her kitchen table, coffee growing cold beside her, scrolling through the flood of responses. You've gotten 17 texts already? David asked, placing a fresh cup of coffee in front of her. It's not even 8 o'clock. 23 now, Marissa corrected, putting her phone face down on the table. And that doesn't count the emails to my HOA account. Tommy wandered into the kitchen, still in his space-themed pajamas, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Mom, are we still painting Jupiter today?" Marissa smiled, grateful for the reminder of normal life. "Absolutely, buddy. Right after breakfast." As Tommy settled at the table with his cereal, Marissa's phone buzzed again. This time it was Joe Rivera, the HOA president, calling. She stepped into the living room to answer. "Emergency board meeting at noon," Joe said without preamble. "Can you make it?" "I have a half shift at the hospital starting at 2, Marissa replied. "We'll keep it short then. This needs addressing immediately," Joe insisted. "Half the neighborhood is talking about what happened last night." After hanging up, Marissa returned to the kitchen where David was helping Tommy with his breakfast. "They've called an emergency HOA meeting about last night." David set down the juice pitcher with more force than necessary. "So now they care?" "After how many incidents that you just handled on your own?" "David," Marissa said quietly, glancing meaningfully at Tommy. Their son looked up, milk dribbling down his chin. "Is this about the lady who thought Mom was a bad guy?" The parents exchanged surprised looks. "How did you hear about that?" David asked. "Bobby Henderson's mom called Mrs. Henderson last night," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "He was filming it on his phone. Bobby texted Ryan, and Ryan told me." He shrugged as if this rapid spread of information was the most natural thing in the world. Marissa sighed. Of course the kids already knew. In some ways, the children's grapevine worked faster than the adults. By the time Marissa arrived at the community center for the emergency meeting, the small room was packed. All 7 board members were there, along with at least 30 residents squeezed into chairs or standing along the walls. She spotted Lisa sitting alone in the back corner, looking uncomfortable. Joe called the meeting to order, his usual easygoing manner replaced by a more formal tone. "We've called this emergency session to address an incident that occurred last night at our community pool, involving our pool committee chair, Marissa Johnson." Heads turned toward Marissa, expressions ranging from sympathy to curiosity. She kept her face neutral, years of practice helping her maintain composure under scrutiny. "Before we begin," Joe continued, "I want to make something clear. Oakwood Gardens has always prided itself on being a welcoming community. What happened last night does not reflect our values." A hand shot up from the crowd. It belonged to Mrs. Washington, the elderly woman who had dispersed the onlookers the night before. "Pretty words, Joe, but let's be honest. This isn't about one incident or one person's mistake. This is about a pattern." Murmurs rippled through the room. Mrs. Washington wasn't finished. "I've lived here for 29 years. I've seen how people look at me, at my grandchildren when they visit, at the other black families who've moved in. We notice things the rest of you don't have to." The room fell silent. Mrs. Washington turned to look directly at Lisa. "What happened to Marissa happens because people don't know their neighbors anymore. We live behind our phones and computer screens instead of talking to each other." Lisa shrank further into her chair, but to her credit, she didn't look away. Joe cleared his throat. "You're right, Mrs. Washington. And that's why, effective immediately, the board is implementing several changes." He outlined a new plan, mandatory orientation for new residents that included introductions to board members and committee chairs, community events designed specifically for neighbor interaction, and sensitivity training for anyone in a leadership position. Additionally, Joe added, "We'll be creating a community relations committee specifically focused on making Oakwood Gardens more inclusive and connected." From the back of the room, Lisa raised her hand tentatively. When Joe acknowledged her, she stood up, visibly nervous but determined. "I'd like to volunteer for that committee," she said, her voice shaky but clear. "I made a terrible mistake, and I want to learn from it. I want to help make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." The room went quiet again, all eyes moving between Lisa and Marissa. The ball was in Marissa's court now, and everyone knew it. Marissa felt a tangle of emotions, fatigue from constantly educating others, skepticism about whether real change would happen, but also a spark of hope that perhaps this time might be different. 6 months had passed since that evening at the pool. The winter chill had settled over Oakwood Gardens, bringing with it holiday decorations and a blanket of snow that covered the now-closed swimming pool. Marissa pulled her coat tighter as she walked toward the community center. The lights inside glowed warmly against the early evening darkness. Today marked the first Oakwood Gardens Cultural Festival, an event that had grown from a small suggestion at that emergency meeting into something the entire neighborhood was talking about. As she approached the entrance, she spotted David and Tommy already waiting for her. Her son bounced excitedly on his toes, clutching a poster board. "Mom, hurry up," Tommy called out. "People are already looking at my science project." Marissa quickened her pace, careful not to slip on the icy path. "Sorry I'm late." The board meeting ran long. David greeted her with a kiss on the cheek. "How did the vote go?" "It passed," Marissa said, unable to keep the pride from her voice. "Starting next month, I'm officially the new HOA vice president." "That's my girl," David grinned, opening the door for her, making changes from the inside. The community center was transformed. Tables lined the walls, each displaying food, photographs, artwork, and information about different cultures represented in their neighborhood. Children dashed between exhibits, collecting stamps on their passport worksheets. Adults mingled, plates of food in hand, conversations flowing more freely than Marissa could remember at any previous community event. In one corner, Mrs. Washington sat surrounded by a small audience, telling stories about the neighborhood's history and how it had changed over her nearly 3 decades of residence. Her hands moved expressively as she spoke, her audience captivated. "There you are," Joe called out, waving Marissa over to where he stood near the refreshment table. "Our cultural festival committee chair has finally arrived." "Sorry again," Marissa said, "but everything looks amazing." The committee really outdid themselves. "You mean you outdid yourself," Joe corrected. "This was your vision." Marissa shook her head. It was a group effort. Everyone contributed. And they had. Over the past months, the newly formed Community Relations Committee had worked tirelessly. What started as awkward meetings with guarded conversations had gradually evolved into genuine collaboration. People who had lived as strangers despite being neighbors for years were finally getting to know one another. "Marissa," a voice called from behind her. She turned to find Lisa standing there, clipboard in hand, wearing the same volunteer t-shirt as the other committee members. "The children's craft table is running low on supplies," Lisa reported, "and the Patols need help setting up their dance demonstration." "I'll handle the craft supplies," Joe offered. "You two deal with the dance setup." As Joe walked away, Marissa and Lisa headed toward the stage area together. Their relationship had evolved into something neither of them could have predicted on that summer night by the pool. Not quite friendship, the beginning had been too painful for that, but a working relationship built on Lisa's consistent efforts to make amends through actions, not just words. "Your son's solar system display is impressive," Lisa commented as they walked. "He explained all the moons of Jupiter to my nephew for about 20 minutes. Marissa laughed. "That sounds like Tommy. Space is his current obsession." They worked side by side, helping arrange chairs and sound equipment for the upcoming performance. The awkwardness that had initially marked their interactions had gradually faded, replaced by a cautious but genuine respect. As they finished setting up, Lisa paused. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful for what happened that night." Marissa raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "Not for what I did," Lisa clarified quickly. "I'll always be ashamed of that. But for what came after. I was so isolated when I moved here. I didn't know anyone. Now," she gestured around the room filled with neighbors talking, laughing, and sharing their lives with each other. "Now I'm part of something." Marissa followed her gaze, taking in the scene. The emergency orientation program for new residents had expanded into a comprehensive welcome committee. The community newsletter now featured profiles of different families each month. The once sparsely attended HOA meetings were now packed with engaged residents. "It shouldn't have taken what happened to make these changes," Marissa said honestly, "but I'm glad some good came from it." From across the room, Tommy waved excitedly, beckoning his mother to come see something. David stood beside him, giving Marissa a thumbs up. "Your family's waiting," Lisa noted. "Go ahead. I can finish here." Marissa nodded and started toward her family, but turned back briefly. "Hey Lisa, the Spring Pool Committee has an opening. You should consider applying." Lisa looked surprised, then smiled. "I'd like that." As Marissa rejoined her husband and son, she looked around at the community that had transformed itself. Not perfectly, not completely, but meaningfully. Sometimes change came from the most painful moments, from confronting the uncomfortable truths that people preferred to ignore. "Ready for the cultural showcase?" David asked, putting his arm around her shoulders. "Absolutely," Marissa replied, leaning into his embrace. "I wouldn't miss it for the world."